Not only is Ramadan very unhealthy for people, but it's potentially deadly, because the further away you get from the equator, the longer days get in the summer. In Norway, the day lasts 24 hours in the summer. So if Ramadan falls within that time frame, that means Muslims wouldn't be able to eat for 30 days. In other words, they'd die.
Huh?
Assalamu alaikum. So I found this piece of art, King Critical's 5 Reasons Why He's Not Muslim. You see, Critical makes a lot of really bad points and commits a cardinal sin several times during the video. It's pretty much worse than stubbing your toe with a dumbbell in your room.
Dwayne, you have a totally different sort of idea about Sister Lucy than...
Yes.
Was she human?
No, absolutely not.
She was not human.
She was innate. But there are a number of scientists who are not creationists. They're evolutionists. Charles Oxnard, University of Southern California, Lord Zuckerman, a very famous British anatomist who studied these fossils for many, many years using the most sophisticated methods of analysis, said that those creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate to ape and man, and they certainly are not ancestral to man.
Did you notice what he just did? He just used a debate technique where he spouted several weak claims in a quick succession that shifts the burden of proof onto the opponent to disprove the claims. Interestingly, this debate technique became known as a Gish Gallop, specifically because of Dwayne Gish, who is speaking in his clip, and his frequent use of this technique in evolution debates. The term was coined by Eugene Scott to describe Gish's characteristic debate style of overwhelming opponents with rapid-fire claims. Now we find Critical abusing this, so for that purpose, I'll put a counter for every single time this guy commits a sin worse than shirk.
It's slightly more of a fun argument than a knockdown one, but it's basically that Islam can't possibly be a global religion. See, Islam claims to be the final revelation for the whole world, even though it seems to be very much focused on 7th century Arabia.
During that time, they didn't have cell phones, so they couldn't make videos like this in order to spread the message. So instead what they did with all messengers, they first spread the message to their native land and their native languages so others could easily understand them. And with Muhammad, it was the same. He first spread his message to Mecca and Medina, but later sent delegates and letters to surrounding nations like Abyssinia, Byzantium, and the Persians. Allah calls Muhammad a mercy for mankind and the seal of the prophets in Quran 21:107 and 33:40 respectively. And the Quran constantly speaks, "O humanity, ayyuhan nas," whereas in the New Testament, Jesus says, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel" in Matthew 15:24. But I'll take the bait. What's your fun argument?
But okay, here's the fun thing. You're probably aware that a key part of Islam is Ramadan, where Muslims are supposed to fast from sunrise to sunset. Now, there's lots of fun facts about Ramadan, like in Muslim countries, the average caloric intake during Ramadan actually increases. Before sunrise and immediately after sunset, they have 2 massive feasts, which doesn't really seem like fasting to me. I mean, maybe intermittent fasting like that could at least be healthy for someone if they weren't also required to abstain from water.
The Merriam-Webster dictionary labels fast as a time of fasting of which you abstain from foods. So technically this is fasting, but I would actually agree with you somewhat. You see, many Muslims tend to eat more during than outside of Ramadan, but we really shouldn't be doing that. Muhammad ﷺ tells us to fill a third of our stomach with food, a third of our stomach with water, and a third of our stomach with air. Yet, we don't really do this. He also tells us that the fasting person has 2 joys, one when he breaks his fast, and one when he meets his Lord and rejoices over his fasting. So yes, we do have to work on that. But we don't fast because, we'll shave off a few pounds, akhi.
But the real issue is that not only is Ramadan very unhealthy for people, but it's potentially deadly, because the further away you get from the equator, the longer days get in the summer. So all those immigrants moving from the Middle East to Europe don't realize what they're signing up for, because around the Middle East, daylight doesn't really fluctuate that much throughout the year. In Norway, the day lasts 24 hours in the summer. The sun doesn't set from early May to late July. So if Ramadan falls entirely within that time frame, that means Muslims wouldn't be able to eat or drink for 30 days. In other words, they'd die.
إليهم فصلوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون. Then ask those who have knowledge of the scriptures. So what do the knowledgeable say?
The Fuqaha say that those people who live in those areas, the North Pole and South Pole in the polar region where it's 6 months day and 6 months night, they should follow the timings of the country closest to them, which has very clear-cut demarcation of day and night. They should follow the timings of these countries for fasting as well as these countries for praying 5 times salah.
But Islam is supposed to be a religion for the whole world. Well, that doesn't work when there are entire civilizations north of certain latitudes where you literally could not be Muslim. You can kind of consider the Arctic Circle like an anti-Muslim force field. Now, sure, we could just say that in a perfect Islamic world, nobody would live in those areas. Or maybe they'd live there and then they would migrate south whenever there's a Ramadan that occurs during the summer months. Or perhaps they should be there and they should just starve to death as martyrs for Muhammad's lack of knowledge of axial tilt.
Yeah, because when you go to the Arctic, Gog and Magog are standing right there with pitchforks and a sign that says "Stop Islamism." Nah, but notice something interesting. He commits his first Gish Gallop here. But anyways, let's continue.
Alternatively, Alternatively, you could do what Muslims actually do, which is lie about this being an issue, because there are Muslims in these areas, and what they've decided is just to completely ignore the commands of the Quran and just make up when they feel like fasting whenever Ramadan occurs in the summer. There's actually a whole Wikipedia page on Islam in the Arctic, and the basic conclusion is that Muslims just decide for themselves when they feel like fasting, in complete contradiction to the Hadith. If you're going to tell me that Muhammad was sent by God to provide a revelation to all people, then I feel like that revelation should actually be applicable to all people. If you're going to tell me this whole issue was just an oversight, then that seems like a pretty deficient view of God.
The interesting thing about Ramadan is that you don't know if somebody actually completes their fast. Maybe they snuck in a shawarma with extra tahini.
مرحبا وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
يا شيخ اليوم بالغلط وقعت أمي شاورما مع زيادة طحينة.
نعم.
وكمان قطعة تفاح وتقريبا 3 لتر مي. فمش عارف هل أكمل صيامي ولا أطعمني الله وسقاني.
So regardless, it's upon the individual to complete their fast. So yes, it is applicable to all people, but different people get different tests. Like, if I lived in the Vatican, it might be a little bit hard to be Muslim versus living in Afghanistan.
Christianity, by the way, actually could be a universal religion. There's nothing about Christianity that you wouldn't be able to do anywhere on earth. And one of the reasons for that is because Christianity doesn't really try to micromanage every aspect of your life. There's basic standards about what constitutes moral behavior, but it's all very adaptable to cultural and environmental considerations. Micromanaging every aspect of your followers' lives might not be great if you want to spread your religion across the whole globe, but it would be pretty good if you wanted to maintain a cult-like level of control over those who believe in the religion.
Buddhism is universal, atheism is universal, but obviously we don't really believe in them. Islam is also universal, but you're clearly getting it twisted. We're not really micromanaged by God when we have free will. We're simply deciding on a day-by-day basis to follow halal or haram. But according to your standard, micromanaging to maintain cult-like control worked enough to spread Islam globally. It's almost as if a prophecy is being fulfilled as we speak.
It's a redundant revelation. However nonsense you think Christianity is, at least it has a point. It's advancing on the biblical narrative so far in a really sophisticated way. That's why Christians still read the Old Testament, because it's part of the same story. Like, even if you think Christianity is no more credible than the mad rantings of a raving lunatic, that would still make it way more credible than someone who comes along 600 years later, claims to agree with those mad rantings, reject random parts of it, add a whole load of other nonsense on top of it, and then claims that was the message intended all along.
So when Allah calls the leader of Egypt during Joseph's time king, but calls the leader of Egypt during Moses' time Pharaoh, is that random? Well, in Genesis 41:14, it quotes, "So Pharaoh sent for Joseph." Yet, when we read the Bible, the Quran, and Science by Dr. Maurice Bucaille, it quotes in the last paragraph of page 147, present-day commentators ranging from P. Monset to Daniel Robs think that, in all probability, the arrival of Joseph and his brothers coincided with the movement of the Hyksos towards Egypt in the 17th century BC, and that a Hyksos sovereign probably received them hospitably at Avaris in the Nile Delta. There can be no doubt that this guess is an obvious contradiction to what has been contained in the Bible. We can see pretty clearly that this would be a chronological error, calling the leader a pharaoh instead of a king. But the Quran actually gets this correct. In Surah Yusuf, verse 43, it quotes, "And one day the king said," and we only know about this recently because of the Rosetta Stone, which was discovered in 1799, which allows us to translate the dead language of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Also, in Genesis 2:2, it quotes, "So on the seventh day he rested from all of his work," in reference of God. And in the Quran, in the famous Ayat al-Kursi, it quotes, "Neither drowsiness nor sleep overtakes him." So the author of the Quran randomly picked verses and stories to copy from the Bible, but accidentally corrects them logically and historically.
Even when you're looking at the Bible, Muslims didn't pick the best stuff to believe. For example, most Muslims accept the nativity account, even though that's actually the part of Jesus' life that is the most disputed by biblical scholars. Meanwhile, Muslims reject the crucifixion account, even though secular scholars will tell you that if there's one part of Jesus' life you should actually accept, it would be his crucifixion, attested to by 4 separate authors. So the only way that Islam could be salvaged as anything other than a redundant advancement on the Bible would be if it in some way improved upon it. But as I've just shown, it doesn't. It rejects the most credible parts of the Bible while accepting some of the least credible parts.
Right, so Muslims don't really have a problem to what secular scholars say about the crucifixion, because by definition, secular means they're a naturalist, meaning you don't believe in the supernatural. In the Quran, something supernatural happened during the crucifixion. Jesus was raised to heaven instead of dying as a man from a man. And as I mentioned before, the Quran definitely improves on the Bible. Another way it improves is by giving clarification of previous messages, adding more emphasis on self-accountability.
The main claim Islam has to being an improvement is that they believe in pure, unadulterated monotheism, while Christianity believes in that Trinity nonsense. So basically, just a bunch of humans claiming that an immaterial, timeless, all-powerful being, well beyond human comprehension, can't possibly exist as one being and 3 separate persons. Now, I don't know about you, but I have very little evidence about what is and isn't possible for God. So what are Muslims going off here? Just vibes? I'm gonna need a little bit more than just vibes to take your word over the accounts of the people who were actually there.
So what's the best way to know more about God? Well, it would be to hear directly from him. Good thing we have the Quran in Surah Ikhlas. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. You see, this isn't just vibes, this is the Quran. So if Muslims believe this is from God, then of course the speech of the all-knowing takes precedence over any human-altered biblical account, just as mentioned in 378. But now, alhamdulillah, Mufti Critical is now going to speak on why the history of Islam is flawed.
The history of Islam has holes in it. I bring this up now because it catches Islam in an inescapable bind. See, if Muslims claim that Jesus and his disciples were Muslims, when the Bible doesn't appear to say that at all, they have to be claiming that the history was corrupted super early. The latest gospel account was completed according to the most critical scholarly consensus within 6 decades of Jesus' death. Islam didn't come along until 6 centuries later, and our earliest account of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection came along just a few years later, in the early 50s, while Jesus died in the mid-30s. So that kind of makes 6 centuries seem like a long time.
Alright, so this may come as a shock, but Muslims do not believe in the authenticity of the Bible, because whenever we quote it, it's simply to point out an internal or external contradiction. Now yes, Islam supposedly came 6 centuries after Christianity, but did you know that the Earth's global flood came 500 years before the earliest Old Testament manuscripts in 200 BC? Both floods were caused by divine beings as a response to human actions. A man is chosen to survive. They both build a boat to preserve life. The flood is universal, wiping out all of humanity, and the survivors offer a sacrifice to the divine. Do you got any good guesses? Here's a hint. It's pagan, but it has a kind of cool, recognizable name. Yeah, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its most complete manuscript comes from the 7th century BC, and the earliest flood story historically comes from the Sumerians, the Eridu Genesis in 2100 BC. Just because Gilgamesh and the Eridu Genesis came before the earliest Bible doesn't mean they're factual. So therefore, just because something comes before doesn't mean a revelation of God cannot correct it.
But what a lot of people don't know is that even if we're talking about Islamic history from the 7th century onwards, it's still not very credible. This is probably the biggest blind spot in all of comparative religious study. And I think a lot of people just assume that the story of Muhammad and how Islam came into existence is uncontroversial history. Certainly the stuff that happened immediately afterwards, like the Arabs taking over huge amounts of the world, is just settled history. Firstly, the Quran isn't really a biography of Muhammad, which I hope you already knew. Instead, when people talk about the life of Muhammad, they're almost always talking about the Hadith. And the 6 most reputable and respected Hadith collections in Sunni Islam didn't appear until the 9th century, a full 2 centuries after Muhammad died.
Actually, we do have written hadith predating each of the 6 major collections. I'm about to butcher this, but such as Sahifa Hammam ibn Munabbih, which is dated from 719 or 748. We also have the Sahifa of Sa'id bin Jubair from 1714 and Jami of Ma'mar ibn Rashid from 770. And many of these hadith would go into the 6 major collections. But fun fact, Hammam was actually a disciple of Abu Hurairah, who was a companion to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I mean, if you want to just know more, watch this video by a hadith scholar with a hadith degree for a more in-depth understanding. Also, just do research on your own.
So this would be equivalent to if the Gospels were written in 230 AD. Even the most critical scholar in the world wouldn't place them later than 130 AD, so that's twice as long as even the most critical account. And indeed most Christians claim, and there are in fact good reasons to claim, that the Gospels were all completed before 70 AD. Quintuple the amount of time for error and legend and contradiction to slip in.
That's kind of funny, because if we go by your same logic, only going by full written manuscript, we find the earliest manuscript of the New Testament written around 330 AD. The Codex Sinaiticus, so please be consistent in your standards. But when we're fair to both sides, you still probably question, why do we even trust the hadith if they were only written until many years later? Well, arguably, the best hadith scholar, Imam Bukhari, was the first to collect a wide variety of authentic hadith, apply a strict criteria on what goes in, and place them in an orderly fashion. For example, having the Book of Fasting only mention relevant hadith concerning fasting. So pretty much all Muslims agree that the scholarly work is top tier, maybe except Shias and Ibadis, but that's more of a theological issue. But we can see each hadith's chain of narration, each person within it, and we can also use other sources confirming if people like Abu Hurairah were liars, had a bad memory, all within the biographies called Imam al-Rijal. But by the way, it's not like after Imam Bukhari we stopped checking the authenticity of these hadith. I mean, there's still many people who get degrees in hadith science. He also mentioned that there's quintuple the amount of time for error because Islam came 600 years, which is straight up false. First of all, we already dealt with this claim. You can't really compare the sunnah of Muhammad with the sunnah of Jesus, peace be upon both of them. And the reason why we accept the Quran and Muhammad's account of Jesus is because we believe it's from God, right? Like, he is all-knowing by definition. So just like how we don't have the original manuscripts of the Torah, we still believe in Noah because revelation revelation came later confirming him and his story.
Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of contradiction. Arguably most insane is that a lot of what is supposed to be describing Mecca in these accounts doesn't actually line up with Mecca at all. A lot of the geography is just wrong. Based on this, some scholars argue Muhammad didn't even exist, and many more would say that there's kind of a Robin Hood thing going on, where he's actually an amalgamation of all sorts of different historical figures.
So he links a video by Dr. J. Smith about the 6 reasons why Mecca is a lie. I skimmed through it, but I found it all makes sense. I didn't even know it was possible to have a Gish Gallop within a Gish Gallop, but I was clearly wrong. J. Smith speaks upon a theory that Mecca is fake news, fabricated, and unsurprisingly, he doesn't really provide citations or sources on screen. Instead, he just names an article and takes it as a fact. Now, with a classical Gish, the burden of proof is onto me to actually refute this, but I just simply don't have the time to do so. Then he mentions Robert Spencer. Calling Robert Spencer a scholar has got to be a sin. But again, don't take my word for it. Instead, check out this debate with Robert Spencer and some Muslims who are way more knowledgeable than me. But this is pretty brain rot even for me, so instead of trying to catch this red herring, I'll continue with Critical's video.
And there are some other reasons to view early Islam with suspicion. Easily the most suspicious thing is when the third caliph, Uthman, burned a whole load of Qurans because they didn't agree with the version that he decided would be the official Quran from now on.
Yeah, so this is blatantly false. Let me just quickly tell you the full story. So Abu Bakr became the first caliph 2 years after Muhammad's death, and after a huge battle, many of the Quran's memorizers died. So many that it forced Abu Bakr to compile a Quran in full written form so it can't be lost, and the third caliph Uthman would eventually standardize the Quran, but without the dialectical recitation, basically a skeletal text, meaning the words and meaning would be consistent and that any of you can recite it with a proper qira'at. And at this point, many of the Prophet's companions already had Uthman's Mus'haf, but they also had private copies written with exegesis or interpretations, so Uthman burned these musahif to avoid future confusion on what is the Quran.
Let's be honest, if there was any account of some important Christian burning a whole load of Bibles because they didn't agree with the Bible that he wanted everyone to be reading, Muslims would take that as definitive proof that the Bible had been corrupted and was a perversion of the Word of God. But instead, because it's their book that has these issues, they're forced to pretend this isn't an issue at all. And that's what I mean in saying Muslims are caught in a double bind, because if they critique Christianity, then they have to apply those same criticisms to Islam where they are far more damning, and therefore Islam would be false. But if they can't critique the Bible, then they can't justify their claim that the Bible is wrong about key biblical figures, and therefore Islam is false.
We do not need to criticize the Bible to prove Islam is true. The Quran stands on its own merits as divine revelation, but there are some key differences to how the Quran and the Bible were preserved. For example, with the Quran, it was compiled within 2 years of Muhammad's death under Abu Bakr. It had multiple companions who had memorized it completely, standardized under Uthman with the consensus of companions, maintains one consistent text across all Muslim communities, and has an unbroken chain of oral transmission alongside the text. But when we look at the Bible, it was written over many centuries by many anonymous authors. The earliest complete manuscripts are from the 4th century. Different Christian communities had different canon, just like how today the Ethiopians differ in books with the Protestants. And there's also multiple versions and translations with significant variations, like the story of the adulteress. The Quran's preservation was systematic and well documented from the beginning. This standard far exceeds what the Bible is and what it could have ever been. Sanam, so Critical has 2 more awful points with 3 times the amount of Gish Gallops. So far, he's 3 for 3 on Gish Gallops, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, I didn't really have enough time to handle all of his points, so if you want a part 2, 200 likes and inshallah I'll do it. As you can see, it's snowy here. It literally does not snow in Texas. I think it's been about like 4 years. But anyways, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.